General Briggs, yelling, "You don't belong here. Get your worthless ass out of my unit." Jamal Carter, clenching fists, controlling his breath. "With all due respect, sir." General Briggs, stepping closer, voice like a blade. "Respect? You haven't earned a damn thing. You want to prove me wrong? Do it right now." The other soldiers stood frozen, tension thick in the air. No one spoke. No one moved. Jamal took a slow, steady breath. His muscles tightened, not from fear, but from restraint. He could feel their stares, their doubts. But what they didn't know? Jamal Carter was no ordinary soldier. The scorching sun beat down on the military training ground, baking the dirt beneath their boots. The air was thick with sweat, metal, and discipline. Rows of recruits stood stiffly at attention, muscles aching from relentless drills. Some shifted nervously. Others locked their eyes forward, not daring to breathe out of turn. Among them stood Private Jamal Carter, tall, built, focused. His uniform was drenched in sweat, but still crisp, every button in place. His deep brown eyes held the kind of determination that couldn't be broken. His breathing was measured, his posture unshaken. Because weakness? That wasn't an option. Jamal had fought for this moment, fought harder than most. Born and raised in Chicago's South Side, he had spent his life proving people wrong. Teachers, cops, neighbors, even his own family. Some said he wouldn't make it past 18. Others believed his life would follow the same cycle. Struggle, survival, silence. But Jamal Carter wasn't built for silence. When the world told him he wasn't enough, he pushed harder. When doors closed in his face, he kicked them down. And when people said, "You don't belong," he made damn sure they had to watch him rise. Joining the military wasn't just about serving his country. It was about rewriting his story, about breaking the mold that had been set for him before he could even speak. But not everyone saw it that way. A sharp whistle sliced through the thick air. Boom, boom, boom. The sound of heavy boots echoed as General Robert Briggs stormed across the field, his presence a force of nature. A man built from war, weathered by decades of combat, discipline, and unwavering belief in the chain of command. Briggs was military to his core, and in his military, men like Jamal didn't belong. His cold blue eyes scanned the line of recruits, searching for weakness like a predator sizing up its prey. And when his gaze landed on Jamal, it locked on like a target. "Carter!" Jamal didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir!" Briggs stalked forward, stopping inches from his face. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Do you know why you're still here, Private?" Jamal's heartbeat slowed, his mind calculated. He knew this game. "Because I earned it, sir." Silence. For a moment, a flicker of something crossed Briggs's face. Irritation? Amusement? Then a scoff. Briggs took a slow step back, arms crossed, his voice laced with cold authority. "Earned it?" He let the words hang in the air, letting every recruit hear them. "You think just showing up means you've earned a damn thing?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "You're soft, Carter. You're a liability." A few recruits shifted. No one spoke. No one dared. But Jamal? He held Briggs's gaze, unwavering, unshaken. Because this wasn't the first time someone had doubted him, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. The relentless afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training field, the air thick with the scent of sweat and dust. Recruits stood at attention, their bodies stiff, their expressions unreadable. But beneath the surface, they all knew what was happening. This wasn't just another test. This was a message, and Jamal Carter was the target. "Drop and give me 50!" The order rang out like a gunshot. Jamal hit the ground, palms pressing into the scorching dirt. His muscles screamed from exhaustion, but he moved with precision, controlled, focused, relentless. 1, 2, 3. General Briggs watched from above, arms crossed, eyes locked onto him like a hawk circling its prey. This wasn't about discipline. This wasn't about making Jamal a better soldier. This was about breaking him. Jamal had seen it before. Teachers who underestimated him, cops who judged him before he spoke, neighbors who assumed the worst before they knew his name. Briggs was no different. But Jamal? He was built for this fight. "Faster, Carter!" His arms trembled, sweat dripping from his brow. 30, 31, 32. The other recruits exchanged uneasy glances. Some silently rooted for him, others kept their heads down, afraid to be next. Briggs took a slow step forward. "You think that proves something?" he sneered. Jamal kept moving. "You think you belong here? 45, 46, 47. Briggs crouched down, voice low and venomous. "You don't, and you never will." 50. Jamal pushed up, chest heaving, but his gaze was steady. He refused to show weakness, because weakness wasn't an option. That night, as the recruits prepared for rest, an order rang through the barracks. "Carter! Field! Now!" Murmurs spread like wildfire. No one was called out at this hour unless it was serious. Jamal grabbed his gear and stepped outside, his heart pounding. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. Waiting for him under the floodlights was General Briggs. Behind him, a row of senior officers, and in front of them, a brutal endurance challenge, a long, muddy trench filled with ice-cold water. Thick ropes dangled above it, a near impossible course. Briggs crossed his arms, smirking. "Here's the deal, Carter. You make it across this obstacle in under 2 minutes, or you're done." Jamal's jaw clenched. He knew what this was. It wasn't training. It was a setup, a humiliation tactic, a way to force him out. The other recruits gathered nearby, watching in silence. Some wanted to cheer for him. Others were too afraid. Briggs' voice was mocking. "Or you can quit now. Save yourself the embarrassment." Jamal took a deep breath. Not a chance. A whistle blew, and he ran. The challenge was rigged. Jamal leaped onto the first rope, fingers burning as he swung across the freezing trench. His grip tightened, his arms burned, but he held on. He climbed up the first platform, his muscles aching. Then he saw it. The next rope was farther than it should have been, too far for a fair challenge. Briggs had made sure of it. Jamal took a deep breath. He had to make it. He took a running start and jumped. For a second, time slowed. His fingers brushed the rope and slipped, cold. The impact hit like a freight train. The ice-cold water exploded around him, stealing the breath from his lungs. His body went into shock, every nerve screaming in protest. Laughter erupted from the sidelines. Briggs shook his head. Pathetic. Jamal's body screamed for him to stay down, to give in, to let the cold swallow him whole. But then he gritted his teeth and pushed up, gasping for air, dripping, shaking, but still standing because he refused to break. Briggs watched him struggle out of the trench, his expression unreadable. "You're done, Carter. Pack your bags." Jamal stood there, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. His mind raced. He had done everything right. He had given everything. And yet it still wasn't enough. Was this really how it ended? Then a voice rang out. "Sir, that wasn't fair." The soldiers turned. It was Private Dawson, one of the top recruits. Briggs' expression darkened. "Excuse me?" Dawson stepped forward, voice strong. The rope was too far. That wasn't a test. It was a setup. A murmur rippled through the other soldiers. They had all seen it. They all knew. Briggs' eyes flickered with rage. He opened his mouth to retaliate, but before he could speak, a deep voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." A tall, imposing figure stepped forward. Colonel Jonathan Harris, a high-ranking officer, a man who commanded respect. And his eyes? They were locked onto Briggs. Jamal could feel it, the shift in the air. Something big was about to happen. And for the first time, Briggs wasn't the one in control. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The entire training ground had gone silent. Soldiers stood frozen, their eyes locked onto the two men in the center of it all. Jamal Carter, soaking wet, exhausted yet still standing, and General Robert Briggs, stiff, fuming, his authority cracking for the first time. Between them, Colonel Jonathan Harris, a high-ranking officer, a man of discipline, respect, and power. And right now, his gaze was locked onto Briggs. That's enough. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than any command barked on that field. Briggs turned, his jaw tightening. "Sir, this is my unit." Harris took a slow step forward. "And yet I don't recall authorizing hazing as part of military training." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Soldiers exchanged nervous glances. Briggs clenched his fists. Carter failed the test. He doesn't have what it takes. Jamal's chest rose and fell as he steadied his breathing. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to show it. He had already proven himself. But that had never been enough for men like Briggs. Harris tilted his head, his sharp eyes never leaving Briggs. Did he fail? Or was he set up to fail? The recruits stiffened. Even the officers behind Briggs hesitated. They had all seen it. They all knew. Briggs scoffed. "I run my unit as I see fit." Harris didn't blink. "And that's where you're mistaken." A cold silence settled over the field. Jamal could feel it. The shift. The moment power changed hands. "Private Carter." Harris' voice was sharp but even. Jamal straightened, standing at full attention. "Sir!" The colonel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Return to formation." Jamal didn't hesitate. He stepped back into line, but the weight of what had just happened settled over the crowd. This wasn't just about a failed test. This was about exposing the truth, and Briggs knew it. Briggs turned back to Harris, his face red with anger. "Sir, with all due respect—" "You're dismissed, General." The words cut through the air like a blade. A visible shockwave rippled through the crowd. Briggs staggered. "What?" Harris took another step closer, his voice unwavering. "Pack your things. You're done here." The entire field erupted in murmurs. Briggs opened his mouth, his pride demanding he fight back. But then he saw the officers behind him. None of them moved. None of them would stand with him. Not after what they had just witnessed. Because for the first time, Briggs was alone, and he knew it. The shift in power was complete. Briggs' face twisted with rage, but there was nothing left to say. His authority? Stripped away. His power? Gone. With a clenched jaw, he turned sharply, marching off the field, his final exit. And the moment he disappeared, something changed. The soldiers stood taller. The fear was gone. And in the center of it all, Jamal Carter, still standing, still here, still undefeated. Colonel Harris turned to the recruits. "You want to prove you belong here?" His gaze landed on Jamal. "Then train like soldiers, work like soldiers, and earn your place the right way." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding. Because this moment, it wasn't just a victory, it was justice, and the world had just witnessed it. The battlefield had changed, the power had shifted, and General Briggs was gone. But this was only the beginning. Jamal Carter stood in formation, his back straight, his breathing steady. He had won, but not just for himself, for every soldier who had ever been doubted, for every recruit who had been told they didn't belong, for every man who had been set up to fail just because of who they were. The air was different now. The soldiers around him stood taller. Their eyes no longer held fear, but respect, because they had all witnessed something powerful. Truth had prevailed. Justice had been served. And Jamal Carter had beaten the system that tried to break him. Colonel Harris turned to face the recruits, his expression unreadable. "The world doesn't care about your excuses," he said, his voice steady. "It cares about your actions, and today you all saw the difference between power and leadership." His gaze landed on Jamal. "Private Carter." Jamal snapped to attention. "Sir?" A long pause, then a nod. "You belong here." The words settled over the field like a command. unshakable, undeniable. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers exchanged glances, others simply nodded, because they knew he had earned it, and no one could take that away. That night, in the quiet of the barracks, Jamal sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt victorious. But instead, he felt something deeper, a responsibility. Because this wasn't just about him. Briggs was gone, but the system that allowed men like him to thrive, that was still there. And if today proved anything, it was that change was possible. The next morning, Jamal walked onto the training field not as the man they had doubted, but as the man they had no choice but to respect. As he passed, recruits stepped aside. Some nodded, some muttered, "Carter." Even the officers acknowledged him, and that's when he knew he wasn't fighting alone anymore, because power isn't given, it's earned, and Jamal Carter had earned every ounce of it. The lessons that remain: leadership is about respect, not fear. Adversity doesn't define you, your actions do. When the system tries to break you, stand taller. If you've ever had to fight for what's right, this story is for you, because justice doesn't come easy, and respect is never given freely. But when you stand your ground, when you refuse to break, the world has no choice but to listen. What do you think? Let's talk. Have you ever faced unfair treatment? Have you ever had to prove yourself when no one believed in you? Drop a comment below. Your voice matters. Like this story? Hit that like button. Share this video, because if we don't tell these stories, who will? Subscribe for more stories that need to be told. Because at the end of the day, the strongest ones aren't the ones in power. They're the ones who refuse to be broken.